Hello and welcome to Healing Spaces, Design Dialogue for Mental Health, where we discuss the latest topics in behaviour and mental health design with industry experts and thought leaders. I'm your host, Edward Larsen, and I head up regional sales in the US for Pineapple, creators of mindfully designed furniture for challenging environments. I'm very pleased to be joined by two industry experts to have a chat today about neurodivergence, ASD, and the importance of design for support and inclusivity going forward. We've got Stephanie Vito, mental and behavioural health design leader and vice president at architectural firm CannonDesign. Stephanie's mission has always been to bring behaviour and mental health to the forefront of design and healthcare, seeking to eliminate stigmas that surround behavioural health by pushing society's preconceptions through design. Jason Beshore is the healthcare principal and associate vice president at healthcare design firm HDR, where he seeks to redefine behavioural health design by infusing proprietary research into design. In a field where evidence-based design and research targeted toward mental health have historically lagged behind, Jason leads the charge to fill the gap and build upon the evidence base to continually improve the standard of care. There's going to be more information of bios on both these individuals and the information related to the podcast. So, Stephanie, let's get started. The discussion that we're going to be having today, obviously a lot about neurodivergence. Tell us a bit about what that means from your perspective. To me, it's a big word, but there's obviously a lot of meaning to it.
Yeah, happy to share, Ed. And I just wanted, before I do, say thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important topic and for having me as part of this podcast. We all have variations in our ability to learn and communicate and to socialize and even how we handle our emotions. But some individuals, have neurological variations that make this particularly challenging for their communication, self-expression, interactions with other people, et cetera. And these day-to-day struggles, really as a result of their differences, we can have an awareness and an understanding from others, especially in the design world and in the built environment, that can make this less of a challenge with this population in mind. So I think we really want to embrace this idea of accommodating a diverse range of these neurological differences among individuals. And we can, focus on creating spaces that are inclusive and supportive of individuals and their diverse cognitive styles, thinking about way we process information, way we interact with space, different sensory sensitivities, et cetera. And so that's really what I kind of think about when starting to think about design for people and populations and how they perceive the built environment.
And it's interesting you say that, because it's not only, you might say, where these folks may be getting immediate care, but it even spreads out into the wider community.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, my work kind of lives in the mental health care kind of under that umbrella in a lot of diverse environments across the country. But I think it's important to use these design considerations, not just in healthcare spaces, but in other areas of our community. So, after someone has an experience in a healthcare space, the goal in any scenario is to allow that individual to go back to their community, back to their daily lives. And that means, those individuals might be engaging in a K-12 school or college, university, or going into the workplace. And these spaces can often be, very difficult or very triggering for someone that has a neurological condition. And using these same principles that we use in the healthcare environment in these spaces in our communities, I think can make that transition a lot more seamless.
That's awesome. And Jason, obviously you're a wealth of knowledge, sir. Can you give us an idea of what designing to support neurodivergent actually entails?
Yeah, great. Thanks. I'd like to just chime in like Stephanie. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you guys about this really important subject. And I think just to tie into that portion of the conversation, I think that it's not just about what it entails, but I do really feel the same way Stephanie does, that we do such a great job. We try to do a great job. The clients that we work with work hard to create these environments where they're at, and being able to work to create those environments in other areas. I think the schools is a really great example where there's things that are needed in the schools from a design and an environmental perspective, from furniture and equipment within the spaces to the design of the space in general. But I really just getting to the topic there that you're talking about, it really paying attention to a lot of things that are triggers within that environment for somebody that falls within this neurodivergent spectrum of the way that their brain is working is really important to look at what are those triggers and understand them, and to try to put yourself in those shoes of those individuals and what they're seeing and what is making them react, and really working closely with the teams that are helping care for those people to understand what those reactions are. I think a lot of times we look at what we do as a design professionals of coming in and understanding it, but talking to those individuals that are treating them, we always find interesting things that are triggering them within the environment that we hadn't thought about that would impact what we're looking to do from a design perspective. And then obviously looking at how those things tie to research and what's out there.
That's awesome, Jason. And I know that a big part of your kind of conversation that we've had even prior to this today has been around how, there's so much going into the younger generation, but obviously these younger generations then grow up to become adults. And there kind of not really been much thought going into that part of it. Be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I really agree on that. I think that we have, almost as a society, have this perception that we're taking care of people that are on the neurodivergent needs spectrum, that we focus and do such a good job when they're kids and pediatrics, and then we forget that these people become adults and their needs don't change. They in some ways they become more complex. And I think that a lot of times, we've been designing spaces as a practice where we look to create some things that we would do where people would think commonly, well, that's, what items or things are you putting in a quiet room space within a facility for people to get away? And what is those kind of items that are supporting that either in the space or the environment in general? And a lot of people are like, oh, well, why are we doing this? This is an adult unit. And we're like, it doesn't matter. You have people that have that need, even though they're an adult. Although adults learn to cope differently, there's a lot of adults all over the place even within our profession, that are neurodivergent, and how do we support them in the society, in the behavioral facilities and education facilities, and how do we do that? I think that we need to get past that stigma in general, that it's not something that we need. It's something that we need to think about when we're designing all spaces, not just behavioral health facilities.
One thing that really resonated with me that Jason was talking about was when he was talking about everyone's unique experiences and everyone as an individual with an individual kind of way that we process information in the world, whether we're neurodivergent or not. And I think that what comes to mind for me is allowing the space or spaces we create to have a lot of flexibility and adaptability in them, because we can't predict all of the kind of struggles that one might have given everyone's unique experiences and kind of lived experiences. We can't predict how everyone is going to react to a certain kind of space or environment, or what would be really difficult for people versus others. And so building in adaptability and flexibility and components in the space that give a sense of agency to people, I think is really important and can go a long way. So the more you have a sense of control over your space, and the more you feel like you can modify the environment if something is really difficult for you or causing an issue, I think the more successful we're going to be as designers. And allowing people to really inhabit the spaces and make them their own, so that they can feel comfortable in their daily kind of activities that they're doing in that space. So I think this kind of goes hand in hand with providing a variety of different kinds of spaces, of scales. Thinking about movable furniture versus fixed furniture is always kind of an issue, especially in the mental health care environment. Fixed furniture is good for certain reasons. Mainly a safety perspective and not allowing people to kind of pick up the furniture, but it also takes away an element of control in the space, right? So you can't decide which direction your chair is going to face. You can't decide what's at your back often. You're kind of, you have to give yourself over to the space in the way that it was originally designed. And so I think any opportunity we have to build in that sense of control and agency into our spaces that we're creating, whether it's in healthcare environment or other spaces in our community, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there, Stephanie. I agree so much. It's a great comment. I try to consider it, and when I ask people, this comes up in design process all the time, and I try to simplify it as personalization. Like if you moved into a space or you moved into a dorm in your college, you have the ability to personalize a space. And I think that when you have somebody that's neurodivergent, their ability to personalize it to what their district need is of what's triggering them, a lot of times they understand what's triggering them without actually knowing it by trying to change their environment. And when we create an environment that's not very changeable to them, that even little tiny things, like you're saying, can you reposition a piece of furniture or a chair that's still safe within the environment that gives them a different view or a different motion or a different control. I definitely think that, personalization is sometimes the way I try to take those and sum it up for people and try to explain it, because I think a lot of times you get people that build up a wall that say, no, you can't do that. That's not safe. It doesn't matter. And trying to get them the tools that they need to understand that it does matter and why them being able to adjust their environment helps them from a treatment process, from a well-being process, from a staff safety process, all of those things, because we all know when these patients go down in that direction and have an episode, a lot of times this patient population is usually injuring the staff and not really other patients and residents around them. So I think trying to help the teams that are making these decisions understand that these tools are something that are actually providing safety in a different way that they don't think about.
I think another thing that comes to mind when we talk about the built environment is how information is relayed to people. I think, there's a lot of, we all kind of know and understand the importance of clear wayfinding in spaces, especially when a building is new to you and you're coming in for the first time and, you're likely running late and trying to get where you're going as quick as possible. Like the importance of wayfinding just is a layer that if it's clear, it doesn't really, have an effect on you or it does in a positive way. But when it's unclear and your kind of agitation is building on some other factors that have already happened throughout your day, it can be really debilitating for people. And I think it's important to keep in mind that not everybody perceives information in the same way. And one strategy that's deployed for wayfinding might not work or might not be successful as thinking about displaying information in multiple methods. So visual, text, graphic, audio, maybe even, and thinking about a way that people can kind of use color, but color is not always successful. So thinking about ways that graphics and kind of infographics, if you will, can layer in another opportunity for people to digest information, I think is important. When we were designing a Chalk Autism Center, we did some kind of Q&A with some of the kids there and actually found out that whenever there was an image of an individual alone, it actually caused a lot of anxiety in the kids. Why is this person alone? Where are their friends? What happened to their parents? A lot of anxiety kind of came out with this idea of viewing an individual as a singular person rather than in groups. And so all of the wayfindings and all of the graphics that were in that facility, actually now we kind of revised the scheme and the strategy to include everybody kind of always in pairs or multiple people in a group. And I think just that engagement with lived experience kind of cohorts layered in a set of information that we didn't know at the time and made that facility even more successful.
Wow, that's I love that. You just made me think, Stephanie, of a really good companion to that. So we have a great wayfinding team, just like you guys do in-house. So we did a project for the Virginia Center for Behavioral Rehabilitation here in Virginia. And the wayfinding graphics are really meant to deinstitutionalize a forensic facility where you have a harder risk of that population, but a big portion of that population is neurodivergent. So we have adults in this facility, obviously, but we have a group of them that are neurodivergent. And we actually interacted with them, a group of them that were pretty high functioning during the design process, and got their feedback in a different way, which was a really cool opposite of what you guys did on the pediatric side. One of the things we did is we have a transitional housing unit, and that's really working on them getting successful within the community as they move out of the behavioral facility out into the community. And the last portion of that was really looking back to some of the graphics that were in the facility that were tied to state parks and the state parks, and that imagery to help them not just be like unit numbers. But the feedback piece was really interesting because we have a grocery store where they're learning to shop and get back to normal functioning life. And we asked them through a survey process to name the grocery store. We just said, hey, we want to name this something meaningful, and we want you guys to be part of this. You're in the transition programs, you're getting back into the community, and really that's an important part of that. And they chose the name to call it Almost Home. And it was really meaningful that they knew that they had this journey and they understood that it was there. And the naming of that facility and that portion of this project is so simple, but to them, it means so much.
That's fantastic and really, really inspiring, the conversation that's really coming out of this. Being able to call a grocery store, almost home, it really does emphasize the fact that these folks are on a journey. And whatever we can do to improve that journey, not only makes it better for the patient, but also the staff. And there's so much that I think goes into the patient side of it, but it's ultimately affecting how the staff are experiencing the space as well. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up. It was on my radar as something to address too, because I think, like you said, there's a lot of discussion out there on patient-centered design, patient-centered care. And I absolutely, of course, it's very important. But I think especially, in the last couple of years, we've learned even more than we knew before the importance and the sacrifice and the hardship that our healthcare staff kind of face on a daily basis, and in particular in mental and behavioral health environments, that it's kind of exacerbated. And anything we can do for the staff that are working in these environments, especially, of course, there are staff working in these environments that are neurodiverse, anything we can do for them to help their day and them process information or an experience on the unit, they would make the facility more successful and enable them to bring their best self right to the day to give care to the patients. And we really encourage on every unit to have a staff respite room. This is a space for an individual to go. I mean, it's almost the equivalent of having the quiet room available for patients on the unit, having this respite space for staff off unit. So in the respite room, we would have things like a rocking chair, their ability to control the light levels, to control music in there, having maybe a weighted blanket in that space. Hopefully we can get it to be an exterior room so they could have view to nature. And I think this idea that staff can step away, can kind of get out of the activity of the unit, a lot of stimulation happening on the unit, a lot of noise, a lot of movement, a lot of social density happening on the unit, allow staff in the same way that we allow patients or provide spaces for patients to do that, allow the staff to have a space that they can really take some respite and clear their heads or process an experience before stepping back out into the milieu. I think that's a really important thing too.
That's excellent. And just from my own personal experience, my brother he's severely autistic. And one of the big things that he struggles with is that social interaction. And I think it's something that's often, a lot of the times within these facilities, there may be a lot of, group rooms, that type of thing, but it doesn't always work for all of these different types of, situations that we're finding. So how does that kind of the social aspect play on the whole design phase within these spaces?
I'm a big proponent of thinking about the periphery of rooms and the periphery that spaces, an individual space can have that can actually be productive to people. So in a sense, if there's social anxiety or other kinds of anxiety or people that struggle with social interaction, like you're mentioning, maybe there's a space on the periphery of a room where they can sit and be in a smaller scale, like alcove, seating space, something kind of more tucked away, an area of comfort and refuge in the room, if they're not quite ready to engage with everything that's happening in that room in a social aspect. they can sit kind of at the periphery and participate or feel like they're participating, feel engaged in the activity that's happening, but not be at the center of it all, not be at the center of the room with other eyes on them, but having their back up against a wall in a more protected space and be able to hear the conversation, to laugh at anything that happens, to be part of the group without being fully immersed, I think can be really helpful for people that struggle with social anxiety and social interactions in an environment like that too.
Yeah, on that same subject, I think one of the things that I wanted to mention exactly, you got me thinking about. So I think that the niches, I'll call them, or the spaces within the environment that you're talking about, they're great examples. When it's possible, it's also great if we can find ways using technology to have patients have different levels of access of when they're more functioning, to be able to move to a space that's outside. All these units always have a porch that's covered that they have access to, based on the way the patients and the facility operates together, because really, that's, to be able to get outside is great. Now, obviously there's a balance there. It's a big balancing act. A lot of times we'll do a porch and we'll put some rocking chairs and some other things out there, but specifically, we had just completed a project in Hawaii a couple of years ago now, and we were worked with as the guide architect for the original project and helped oversee it as one of the owner support side for a couple of years during the process. And one of the things that when we put that RFP together was trying to write in the need for the design team that would do it as a design build project that did do the project, was to have those outdoor spaces built into it. And together, the team and us, they were able to get exterior spaces that were accessible to them, that were safe, that were in this type of environment where they could get away. And those areas that you can get inside were found to be places where it was outside. Also, we were able to provide those porches with raised gardens for gardening and other things that were accessible to certain levels of patients within the population. Jumping to the staff portion about providing spaces for staff, I think that's really important. And I think that when we talking about the needs of the patients with the patients and with the staff, of what the patient's needs are in today's environment, with the difficulty to basically bring in staff, it's very hard to recruit staff. This is a really tough job from anybody that is working in a behavioral health facility. It's not an easy job. The staff really needs the spaces to decompress, like Stephanie was mentioning, and wherever you can find opportunities to get those spaces that are exterior is really great. So we've had a couple of projects where we've been able to create some gardens, healing garden type spaces that are courtyards that are accessed just for staff. So it lets us put some things in there that we would not put in a patient space, but it's a place where the staff can go sit for 5 minutes and decompress and get some air outside and basically have some breathing room.
I love your comment on patient gardens and having access to that on a daily basis in the mental health care setting, because of the tactile stimulation that brings and the direct access to being able to touch and feel and see and engage with nature. I think that's a great idea. Thanks for sharing that.
That's very good. And it's you mentioned about that kind of the touching and different, textures and things like that, and how design can play a huge role in that. Obviously, even just in the texture of a wall to the furniture to whatever that might be. I know with my brother, he loved sifting sand through his fingers. Even water, just loved feeling that movement of things going through his fingers. And he would sit there for hours, playing with just a cup of water and just tipping it out. So it's those things that can really help make it a more comfortable space for these folks. And there's so much more to it. I think, Stephanie, you even mentioned about adjustable lighting, noise obviously been a big part of it. Whether it's even just having soft background music to the different sounds that there are within the facility. I know within behavioral health, one of the biggest struggles is how to deaden that sound down, given the types of spaces they are. But how do you kind of combat that within these spaces?
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to this idea of having a sense of control too. We have a lot of facilities that actually offer headphones to their clients, to the patients on the unit, and they'll be able to choose from, a handful of different kinds of music genres. and get it piped right into their headphones. And they're mobile. They can walk around. They can be, in the quiet room. They can be out on the porch listening to music and music of their choosing. And so I think for those that, again, are overstimulated by a lot of noise, by a lot of social density, that's just one other aspect and component that they can utilize as a tool to help them, on their daily life while they're here and also out in the community. I think another thing that I was thinking about too is when it comes to that kind of positive distraction and kind of tactile distraction that we were talking about, the material, you kind of alluded to it, Ed, the material of the walls and the texture that we can put on the walls, particularly like in some of those more comforting seating nooks or seating areas where someone could be sitting in a comfortable space and have the ability to kind of run their hands over some textured surfaces and get that kind of feedback, that tactile feedback. I think that's something we do to provide another avenue for positive distraction when, anxiety is kind of heightened in a space, in a social setting.
I'm going to jump in on that one. I love some of that. So I agree. I see that the headphones and the Bluetooth technology, I think we all love Bluetooth. We all live it every day. But what I've seen where it can bring such new things into facilities is pretty awesome. It's very exciting that is out there and more facilities are starting to do it. I think in general, the industry needs to create a better product that can really handle the abuse that these things get. I know a lot of the facilities cycle through them quite a bit. So I think it would be great to see as the industry starts creating more products. But I think that in general, it makes me think about that customization, and that whole part of this conversation is that we need to find ways to bring those things into the environment and get the industry to unite technology with furniture. And I know how challenging that is because you have furniture manufacturers that don't want to do electronics and electronics don't want to do furniture manufacturing. But finding ways to integrate some of the great technology that's out there into furniture pieces that can be abuse resistant and not be, tossed around. I know facilities that will have iPads in the units and they'll protect them and all of that. But, imagine what we could do if we could find ways to integrate these more into furniture and design and controllability, or if different things are, connecting to your headphones based on where you are, where you could interact with your environment through where you're at with those headphones, and maybe you get access to different things and, pushing that technology that we're using, from an RFID perspective of location within the facility. How can we push that to another level and really find a way to push that technology so that they can experience the space differently, where technology becomes part of that journey?
That's awesome, Jason, and really inspiring some of the things you're talking about and how, I think it really emphasizes almost how far we've come, but how much further we've still got to go. And we were even having some brief conversation earlier about how there's always this constant change within the world of population, obviously. But with design, generally once a facility is constructed and finished, it kind of becomes set in stone. But there's obviously so much that can change over just, even within the course of a day even. How does that kind of get combated, if you will, within this world of mental health?
That's, you definitely, I think you've heard us both say this, trying to find a way to create flexible environments, things that are changeable. I think about the textures, and we, all of us that are in this profession, battle to look at ways to adjust the environment, to have textures, to have these different things. And it's the balancing act against the infection control side. And how do you do that? And what things like as simple as infection control change the way that you're designing a space and cleanable and what you're doing? And how do you make these things that make this environment personalized, and what that means when you're doing that? How can you make that personalization adjustable and resettable? And what are things that are out there? Sometimes it's just something as easy as a wall that's, a painted chalkboard surface that they can use and they can write on within a unit where they can obviously handle that material. But there's a lot of things like that. I see just a lot of different technologies that we'd like to apply, that are applied, I'll say like applied to a theme park setting where you have certain things that are touchable and interactable that it'd be great to find a way to bring more of those things into the environment where the more of these touch screens can be more abuse resistant, where most facilities are afraid to push too much of that in here because, like you said, when they're up and they're done and they're in stone, they don't have a lot of ability a lot of times to keep funding going to go replace things. And they're nervous to put something in that's expensive, that creates great stuff. But what happens when it breaks and it doesn't get kept up? And how do I keep that? And then obviously back to how does that change as a piece within the environment? Can we put things in that are adjustable and try to think forward how those things can change and create that flexibility with that changing environment?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned that we really have come so far in the last few years. And I think it's great to see all the advances that have been made and the opportunities that we have to make different kinds of choices for the environment that give people within them that flexibility that we've been looking for, but also with high, safety aspect in mind, safety for the patients and for the staff. I think we can enhance what we're doing by including the lived experience perspective more, not only in the design of the environment and of the space, but in the development of the products and the materials and the kind of objects that go within that space. Because I think we're only going to learn more. Like I was saying earlier, we can't really understand how everyone is going to perceive the built environment, but what we can do is ask. And the more information we can gather from a broad, diverse group of people, I think the better. And that will enable us as a design community to start creating products that are more successful, more usable, more enhanced for different kinds of various populations in these environments, and do it in a safe way that allows the facility and the staff to feel comfortable using them and having them in the facility, but then also, again, giving that agency and sense of control over to the patients in these spaces. I think the more comfort and the more kind of precision we can embed in products and in the built environment on day one, that will kind of give them a longer lifespan, right? So we're not so worried about them becoming obsolete a few years after the building it opens. And so I think the more we can layer in that lived experience to make these products better and more functional, I think the longer lifespan they'll have in the environments that we design.
Yeah, and I think on that's a good point, Stephanie. And it makes me think that one thing is a lot of times we push to put the latest technology during the design process into a project. And a lot of times we get pushed back about it being new. But by the time the building opens and it's a year old, it's not new anymore. So I think part of it is, working closely with the teams from the client and the design teams to really make sure that we're pushing the envelope by what's the newest technology today, because the time frame to get there is so long. And we want it to be, it'll be more current likely by the time it gets there, but trying to create that flexibility. Yeah.
It's really interesting as well, Jason, what you've been talking about, like from the technology standpoint, and how that can obviously play a big role from a patient perspective, but even from a staffing perspective, and how to manage the situations and control some of the anxieties. I wondered whether you could speak any more as to that.
In regards to the question about technology and staffing and other things, we actually did a very, very interesting thing. I haven't seen this done on a lot of facilities, and it's an example of pushing that technology. And a lot of most behavioral health facilities are designed in almost like this town center style, where it's a community, and especially facilities that have a lot of parts of the problem where they have, from when you come in and you're sort of in crisis and you're going through the process of getting better. And some facilities have transitions and transitional housing within them. So you have that part of that journey. And I tie all that back to technology by we recently on a project took through a partnership with a couple companies. We took the messaging that you would see in a hotel, right? I'm at a conference and there's this great messaging, and there's a messaging center, and we go to these facilities and we're trying to talk about what's available for the residents that are on a journey where they're navigating. Maybe they have some flexibility in where they are in their level of care. They're higher performing, they're pretty far in their journey, and they have choices. So, there's an opportunity for me to go to group or art, and it becomes less defined as I head to transition. So how does that get explained? to the residents, to the patients, and obviously also to the staff, what's happening on the staff side. So we work with a couple companies, and we helped with a process and developed a message board system that is displaying messages for both residents and staff that are within the housing units. They're all customized to look and feel like they belong in the housing unit, but they're electronic boards that are in a enclosed ligature resistant cage or abuse resistant. They've got Alexa on front. They've got fans in them to cool the TVs, so they're protected, because, we always build our TVs into these boxes in behavioral facilities. So these message boards need to do that. So that gives the facility to create and customize this journey where, for example, they have different levels of, in this specific facility, they have different levels of food preparation. So when you're at a higher level of functioning and working your way through the facility and you're getting closing to be released and you have more flexibility, you have access to more of a cafe space, and that cafe changes the menu. So now this technology is something staff are trained that they can change and interact with, and over time they'll find different ways to use it that we're not even thinking about. It has ways to message, if there's an upcoming, area that they're not going to be able to access if they're doing something in the facility. They can message that to both the patients and the staff. And they also have the ability to, basically if there's a fire alarm event within the building that's connected to a control system that the people that have access can say, hey, this is what's going on. So it actually has a really interesting ADA function that we don't think about from a messaging standpoint, because a lot of those people where they're announcing things, they're also on these message boards that are in every central housing unit. And so if they're hearing, you're providing some ADA components within that. So, it's an example at the end of the day of that use of that technology that's pushing it and bringing something in that's not a behavioral health thing, to say, how can we bring this into a facility that it can provide value to relay information, to create a better environment for the staff and the residents.
I love that example of using technology to give a sense of autonomy for the patients, allowing them to kind of see what activities are available for that day and what kind of giving them the opportunity to make a choice over whether, like you said, they attend group or art, for example. Another area that I'm curious about to see where technology goes is the wearable technology. And right now, I think in behavioral health environments, there's a lot of hesitation about having those kinds of devices around. Of course, there's also HIPAA concerns and patient privacy. But I also think there's a lot of potential for staff to be able to kind of see biometrics from patients and see kind of heart rate and other biometrics that can be used as a informative way for staff to know when a patient maybe is starting to get agitated or when an environment is causing too much stress for that patient. Blood pressure and heart rate and anxiety are kind of all going up. Staff can intervene maybe more early or earlier than waiting for a physical response from that patient. And I think ultimately being able to help that patient de-escalate quicker or prevent an escalation, maybe even by removing them from that environment or changing the course of what their activity is that they're participating in. I think, as I'm kind of tracking the improvements of wearable technology and kind of understanding their development, I'm curious to see how we're going to be able to use that technology in these spaces that can help kind of all patients, but especially those that are neurodiverse.
That's really interesting. And obviously there's a lot of, changes that are happening within the industry. And, some of these are quite dramatic, especially from where we've come, from the years in the past. But how do you find that people are really adapting to this change? Some of it's pretty out there, thinking outside the box. How do you find that these facilities are kind of adapting to that change and taking it on?
Yeah, we talked about how people are adapting to that technology and pushing it. I think the biggest thing really is you find, in my opinion, about half of the population, when we work with trying to get them to integrate these things, is about jumping in and doing it. The other half is worried or scared or misunderstanding of what it means and what it's going to do and what are the risks. And they want to stay, I'll call it old school. And it's always interesting to try to figure out where's the middle ground with those. There always seems to be, honestly, on my experiences, there's not a lot of people that are in the middle. They're sort of on either end, or people that are ready to bridge that. And it really varies by facility and what are the cultures of them to try to integrate that. But I think it goes back to what I was saying about, I think both of us were talking about the wearable technology. I mean, there's RFID technology out there today that facilities are using that are basically helping track a patient, where a patient is, maybe has an integration of a barcode with their band to get their meds that connect to them. We all wear those in the hospital, but how do you put them in a facility? Even those are concerns because, how secure are they? Can the patients get them off? Can they eat them? Can they switch them? Those are all risks around that wearable. And I think everybody's working hard to try to figure out, okay, how do we get that to be working for more patients? And what does that mean? What does it gain them access to? So I think that's a great point. I would love to see the technology go where Stephanie's talking about. I hope that it can get there. I think it's really, when you talk about it, I think the RFID banding specifically, which works really well when we talk about levels of patient care, where they can have access to different areas based on where they're at in their treatment. We're seeing that in RFID technology, but even facilities are always worried about wearing those things. And I think there needs to be better ways to find a way to secure them and get them more comfortable. But then the problem sometimes is, I think when you secure them and you're talking about a behavioral patient, is there a mental component of, they have this thing tracking them on their arm and they understand sometimes more than you realize. And especially with a neurodivergent population, a lot of times touch and feel is such a big deal to them. How much wearable is even possible for them. I know that, to tie back to the neurodivergent conversation, where we have a couple facilities that have used this RFID technology, help basically control access to their rooms and their units and privileged areas. So they get access to different areas and privileged spaces based on how they're doing with their treatment. But I know from speaking to facilities, a lot of the portions of the patient population, what they try to keep together on the neurodivergent side, will not tolerate wearing the devices at all. And how do we do that to try to give them that? And it goes back to this touch piece that some of them just can't handle that.
We also try to support, this conversation when we bring it to our clients with a lot of data. And so just understanding how prevalent neurodiversity is in our communities, like 1 in 5 individuals can really have these neurodiverse variations in the way they process information. And there also is such a strong correlation between neurodiversity and mental illness. And so when you're running a behavioral health unit or a mental health unit, the likelihood or the statistics or ratios, if you will, are likely even greater because of the fact that neurodiversity and mental illness are so co-occurring. Another example is like 80% of adults with ADHD actually have a co-occurring mental illness. And so there is that data out there that's available to our clients that show the kind of prevalence of neurodiversity. And then also when we can use that kind of information to tie it to outcomes and patient and staff safety, I think that also helps with their adaptability and their consideration of including some of these things in their environments.
That's excellent. And I think there's really a lot to think about from our podcast today. And, there's a lot of different topics that we covered off, but obviously focusing on that whole neurodivergence and the changes that are happening around design and adaptability within these spaces. So I want to thank you both for your insights and your contributions today. Certainly very much appreciated, very interesting. And we definitely hope to see you back on the podcast again at some point. Thank you again, Stephanie and Jason.
Yeah, thanks for leading the charge, Ed. And Jason, it was nice to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, same here. Excited to run into you out there in the world.
For sure.
Thank you very much. And for our listeners, thank you for joining us. And make sure you follow our podcast so you don't miss the next episode.